When I was a young Anglican and being prepared for confirmation, as we used to say, by an esteemed canon of St Mary's Cathedral, as was, I was introduced to the clover leaf. The canon thought it was his duty to introduce my group of young teens to a core concept in Anglicanism. He was going to teach us about the Trinity, he said. Some of you will remember confirmation class, the teaching about what was considered essential for an Anglican to know. I don't think we were taught the catechism, at least I don't remember that, but how to understand the Trinity we were certainly taught, and that I do remember. I don't remember either what we were taught about the Bible, but along with a very clear memory about the importance of the Trinity, I learned that if you protested against silly rules, you could get them changed. I learned the Trinity was like a three-leaved clover, and I learned I could get away without wearing a hat and gloves, which were expected refinements to a woman's dress at that time, and that I would be expected to wear to church once I was confirmed into adult membership. Trinity and hats and gloves are forever linked in my mind. These are Susan's words, not mine. Susan has entrusted them to me today as she can't be here. And this sermon of hers is a background to the discussion that I'll be leading after morning tea in the Peace Chapel. Susan goes on. I have never worn a hat to church, she says, but like all good Anglicans, I certainly did learn to picture God through the idea of the Trinity, and to speak about God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I certainly did learn that challenging what seems to be normative can have life-changing outcomes. Just as I gave up the hat and gloves as essential for church attendance, I later gave up the Trinity as important to my faith and practice as an Anglican. But I'm still protesting against unjust and silly rules, and I still do see critique and protest as key characteristics of my Anglican faith. No surprise there. Canon Charles taught us that just as the clover leaf had three separate and distinct leaves, but was one clover, so God had three separate and distinct aspects, but remained one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or Ghost, as we said back then. He clarified this further by asking who we were, and noting that we were at the same time daughter, sister, and friend, or another similar combination of persona. More simply, three or more ways of being, but still one person. It was not till many years later that I discovered we had been carefully taught what was probably one of the Church's most important heresies. We'll come back to that later too if you stay after morning tea. It was an easy way of understanding why these three, God, Jesus, because that's who we thought the Son must be, and Holy Spirit, were seemingly interchangeable in prayers. But of course, this is not so. They're not interchangeable. Each have their own separate identity and role in the Christian story. When it comes to the Trinity, that's a fascinating story. It's a story of pragmatism and power, of identity and difference, of interfaith and intercultural context. How we understand the Trinity and why we have the doctrine of the Trinity, it seems to me, are largely based on cross-cultural miscommunication, with words like hypostasis, homoousios, homoousios being bandied around. Susan says John might talk about this later in the discussion time, and I guess it can't be really avoided, words being what they are. These words originated in the Greek language, were translated into Latin, and later into English, but without a direct concept link and without a biblical reference either. And now we're trying to make sense of them 1700 years later in our contemporary English without a frame of reference for them. Gobbledygook they were, and so they remain. Which is actually why Susan and I once called a chapter on the Trinity, the Magi and the Three Blind Mice. Arguments as to whether God was three persons but one God, and who came first and was therefore most important, and whether Jesus was really God, a divine being, or truly human, flew around. None of it made a lot of sense to me back then, and I must say, it still doesn't. But as I mentioned, I've learned something of the story of how this confusing and convoluted doctrine came to be in the first place, courtesy of Constantine in 325, when he was anxious to clarify who was Christian and therefore entitled to the tax exemptions he had settled on the Christian church, so that he could unify the bishops behind his campaign to consolidate his empire. Again, Susan says I'm going to talk more about this later. We'll see. So 1700 years later, is there anything helpful to us in the notion of Trinity? Certainly the Anglican Church here continues its affirmation of the doctrine. And only last year we were reminded by one of the Auckland bishops that the correct formula for the Trinity was Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Notwithstanding this, there have been many attempts to update the concept and to make it more relevant by using such language as Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, and similar words that allow for less anthropomorphic concepts to take hold. We're familiar with these here in St Matthew of the City. A couple of weeks ago, I used a Trinitarian blessing citing the curiosity of Eve, the courage of Mary, and the energy of Sophia, and another one proclaiming love, hope, and challenge. You can tell I'm well schooled in the use of three, but three doesn't make the Trinity. That is reserved for the formulary Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. No matter what words are used or how Trinity is reframed these days to express the essence or beingness of God, or what formularies are approved by the Church for speaking about God, I still want to say there is nothing essential about Trinity for Christian faith or for speaking about or addressing God. The helpful thing for me regarding the Trinity and the various combinations of threeness is to remind me that there are various ways of coming to know and to speak about God, and many ways to give emphasis to aspects of our Christian faith. There is nothing essential about three, apart from this often being considered the perfect number. The reading from St Matthew's Gospel this morning we heard ends with Jesus' instructions to his disciples to make disciples and to teach them to do as Jesus taught them. In other words, to feed the hungry, to clothe the homeless, to comfort those who are troubled, and to care for the earth. The longer passage of which this is a part contrasts this way of life, these actions, with the guards who are pledged by money to report on activities that suggest the renewal of activities like these because they might disturb the status quo. What the words "make disciples and baptize them in the name of the Father, Son and Holy Spirit" suggest is that the life-changing impact of the heirs of God is not ended. It suggests that the story of God's activity in the world since the beginning to bring justice and compassion among all people is not over. It suggests those who align themselves with those undertaking this work will not be working alone, but rather with Jesus, understood as a child of God, and God's ongoing Spirit. It is our challenge still to choose which group we will commit to: the guards, who pledge to maintain the status quo, or the disturbers, the ones who challenge and protest. For me, it's important not to get sidetracked by the apparent Trinitarian formulary of this verse, using it as proof of the Trinity. Rather, let's recognise that the Gospel writer, writing for a Jewish audience, is claiming Jesus' continuity with the First Testament, in which all three ways of talking about God are used at different times in proclaiming the one God's actions for justice and love, compassion and peace. For me, this text does not prove the Trinity, but links past, present and future. It enables me to stand with the First Testament writers and with Jesus as they struggle to understand the intimate, pervasive presence of God. To stand with the courage of Jesus in challenging the status quo of his day and all the practices and protocols that inhibited people's full life. And to take hold of the future and to act to ensure it will be life-giving for future generations. We can each find ways to interpret the teachings of the Church so that our faith is not stultified. And we can be very glad that our tradition set before us a precedent in which this is not only acceptable but necessary, that we keep on thinking, changing, growing, exploring. I encourage you to keep asking questions about doctrine and formularies, for these are human constructions which may or may not be helpful any longer to your faith. Each of us must find our own way. Amen.